Ladies and gentlemen, we often measure greatness by what can be seen, the titles we hold, the victories we win, the recognition we earn. But the true battles are not fought on the outside. They are fought quietly within the mind and the heart. The illusions we carry, about success, about worth, about happiness, shape our lives more than any external force. And it is only when we dare to confront these illusions that we find the deepest form of freedom. Tonight, I invite you to look beyond the surface and into the place where real liberation begins, within yourself. The ego is a restless force within us, seeking control and recognition. It is the subtle voice that constantly whispers in our minds, directing our thoughts, shaping our actions, and influencing the way we perceive ourselves and others. It never seems to rest because its fuel is an endless hunger for validation, superiority, and survival. The ego thrives on being noticed, on feeling important, on standing apart. Its energy is not gentle or still. It is urgent, demanding, and insistent, always pushing us toward proving something to the world, and often to ourselves. This restlessness can be seen in the way we measure our worth through comparison. The ego urges us to look at what others have achieved and immediately place ourselves in a race against them. It tells us we are falling behind if we are not recognized, admired, or praised. It pushes us into a constant state of striving, not always for growth or learning, but for approval. In its search for recognition, the ego convinces us that our value depends on how others see us, rather than how deeply we understand ourselves. The ego's desire for control is just as powerful. It seeks to dominate not only external circumstances, but also the way people respond to us. It does not like uncertainty, because uncertainty threatens its sense of power. It resists as humility, because humility suggests it might not always be the center of attention. This restless force wants to manage outcomes, dictate appearances, and secure victories at every turn. Even in small daily interactions, the ego demands to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged as superior in some form. It manifests in subtle ways too. The discomfort you feel when your contribution goes unnoticed, the irritation when someone else takes the spotlight, the defensiveness that rises when your ideas are questioned. All are traces of the ego seeking recognition. It is not content with silence, because silence does not confirm its existence. It is not content with being one among many, because it craves uniqueness, even if that uniqueness is built on illusions. At the same time, the ego is fragile, and its restlessness comes from that fragility. Because it is built on external validation, it constantly fears being diminished. If people do not acknowledge its efforts, it feels invisible. If achievements are overlooked, it feels unworthy. This inner insecurity fuels its endless motion. The ego is like a restless child needing to be reassured over and over again, never fully satisfied with the attention it receives. This is why the ego's quest for recognition never ends. No matter how much praise we gather, it quickly fades, and the ego demands more. No matter how much control we seem to have, the ego reminds us of the possibility of losing it. This cycle keeps us restless too, pulling us into battles that often have no real meaning, but consume our energy and peace. Yet the ego is not entirely an enemy. Its force, while restless, also contains potential. Without the ego, we might lack the drive to assert ourselves, to create, to stand firm in the world. The issue is not the existence of the ego, but the dominance it assumes when unchecked. Its desire for recognition, and push us to accomplish, but when it rules us, it blinds us to deeper fulfillment. Its hunger for control can bring structure, but when it takes over, it traps us in fear of losing power. The restlessness of the ego is a mirror reflecting our inner struggles. It reveals how easily we can be swayed by appearances, by status, and by the need to be significant. It exposes the fragility beneath our confidence, showing how often our sense of worth is borrowed from the opinions of others. In understanding this, we begin to see the ego for what it is, a restless force, always seeking, never satisfied, always pulling us outward, away from the stillness of our truer selves. It convinces us we must constantly compare, compete, and prove ourselves. From the earliest stages of life, this force whispers that our worth is never enough as it is. It tells us that value must always be measured against the success of another person. It does not allow us to stand still and simply be. Instead, it urges us to measure, calculate, and place ourselves somewhere along an invisible ladder where others always seem to be higher or lower. This endless comparison is exhausting, yet it feels inescapable, because the ego does not rest until it has drawn a line between us and someone else. Comparison becomes the lens through which we interpret the world. A friend's achievement is no longer simply their achievement. It becomes a mirror that reflects our own insecurities. If they rise, we feel we fall. If they are admired, we sense our own worth has diminished. The ego convinces us that life is a limited stage, with only so much recognition, success, and admiration available, and that if someone else shines, our own light must inevitably fade. In truth, this scarcity is an illusion, yet it feels painfully real when viewed through the restless eyes of the ego. From comparison springs competition. Once we are convinced that worth is relative, the next step is to strive endlessly to outdo, outshine, and outrun others. The ego transforms daily living into a constant contest. It is no longer enough to do well. We must do better. It is no longer enough to be appreciated. We must be applauded. Even in the quietest corners of life, the ego finds room for competition. A casual conversation can become a silent struggle for who speaks more eloquently, who tells the better story, who seems more impressive. A small accomplishment can feel empty if someone else accomplishes slightly more. This drive to compete may give the illusion of progress, but it comes at a heavy cost. Instead of growing from genuine curiosity, we grow from fear of being left behind. Instead of building strength from within, we race forward simply to stay ahead. The ego convinces us that life is not about becoming who we are, but about proving that we are more than others. And in this struggle, we often lose the very essence of what makes growth meaningful. The demand to prove ourselves is the final trap. Comparison creates the fear of not measuring up. Competition creates the pressure to outdo, and proving ourselves becomes the endless attempt to silence those fears. The ego whispers that everything we do must serve as evidence of our worth. A promotion becomes not simply progress in work, but proof that we matter. A compliment becomes a lifeline that reassures us we are enough. An achievement becomes a shield to hide behind so the world cannot see the doubts we carry inside. But the ego is never satisfied with proof for long. As soon as one achievement is secured, it sets another standard, another test, another bar to reach. The cycle repeats endlessly: compare, compete, prove, and then repeat again. The restlessness grows because no matter how much we prove ourselves, the ego raises the stakes higher. The applause fades and it demands more. The recognition passes and it wants to chase it again. The fear of not being enough never disappears because the ego itself is built on that very fear. This cycle shows up in all areas of life. In relationships, we feel the need to prove we are lovable, worthy, or strong. In careers, we feel the need to constantly show that we are indispensable. In personal growth, we even turn self-improvement into another contest, comparing our journey with others, competing for who can be the most enlightened, the most disciplined, or the most resilient. The ego does not care where it finds its battleground, so long as it keeps us in motion, forever chasing validation. What makes this convincing so powerful is that it often disguises itself as motivation. It feels like ambition, but beneath it is insecurity. It feels like drive, but beneath it is fear. It feels like strength, but beneath it is fragility. The ego does not care if we exhaust ourselves, as long as it receives proof that it is superior, even for a fleeting moment. In the end, the voice of the ego convinces us that comparison, competition, and proving ourselves are the only paths to worth. And though the chase never ends, we run it as if it were the only race available. The ego's spell is strong because it speaks in the language of our deepest fears. The fear of being unseen, the fear of being unworthy, and the fear of being forgotten. Living through the ego leaves us fragile and exhausted. It drains us in ways we rarely notice at first because the ego disguises its demands as strength, ambition, or necessity. On the surface, it feels like we are pushing forward, striving for something important, proving our place in the world. But beneath that drive lies a constant tension, a pressure that never relaxes, because the ego never allows us to feel enough. Fragility arises because the ego builds its identity on external foundations. It depends on recognition, on approval, on status, and on appearances. These are things we can never fully control, and so the ego lives in a state of insecurity, always watching for signs that its worth is being questioned. When someone criticizes us, the ego trembles. When someone outshines us, it shatters. When the recognition we crave does not arrive, it feels as if we are invisible. To live through the ego is to balance our sense of self on shaky ground, and that is why even the smallest shake can make us feel as if the entire structure of who we are is collapsing. The fragility also comes from the ego's constant need to defend itself. It cannot allow mistakes, because mistakes feel like threats to identity. It cannot allow vulnerability because vulnerability feels like weakness. It cannot allow humility because humility makes it fear irrelevance. As a result, living through the ego means living behind walls, hiding from any possibility of being seen as less than perfect. But the more walls we build, the more fragile we become, because even the smallest crack in those walls feels unbearable. Exhaustion is the natural outcome of this constant defense. To live through the ego is to live on guard. Every moment becomes a calculation. How am I being seen? What do people think of me? How do I measure up? The energy spent in this endless self-monitoring is immense. It pulls from us silently, like a weight we carry without realizing how heavy it has become. And because the ego never rests, this exhaustion does not go away. Even in success, the mind keeps spinning, asking, what's next? How do I hold on? How do I prove it again? The exhaustion also comes from the battles the ego insists we must fight. It urges us to chase recognition, but recognition fades quickly. It pushes us to compete, but competition never ends. It makes us prove ourselves, but no amount of proof is ever final. We run in circles, chasing goals that dissolve as soon as we reach them. The pursuit consumes our energy, yet gives us no losses. Ting peace. It is like pouring water into a vessel with no bottom. The effort continues, but the fulfillment never arrives. Fragility and exhaustion often show themselves in subtle, everyday ways. The irritation when someone disagrees with us, the discomfort when someone else receives praise, the tightness in our chest when we feel overlooked. All of these are small signs of the ego at work. Each time it is threatened, we feel fragile. Each time it demands attention, we feel drained. The body and mind absorb this tension, leaving us restless even in moments of quiet and unsatisfied even in moments of success. Over time, the cost becomes clearer. Relationships suffer because the ego makes it hard to listen, to empathize, or to truly connect without defense. Work becomes heavier because every task is tied to identity and self-worth. Personal peace feels distant because the mind is rarely still. Living through the ego is not only exhausting for the individual, but also for those around them, because the need for validation often spills over into constant demands on others. The fragility of the ego also prevents us from experiencing life fully. It makes us afraid to take risks because failure feels unbearable. It makes us afraid to be authentic because rejection feels devastating. It makes us afraid to let go because control feels like survival. And so we limit ourselves, exhausting our energy not in living deeply, but in maintaining an image. The irony is that in protecting ourselves through the ego, we become weaker, and in seeking recognition, we lose the deeper recognition of who we truly are. To live through the ego is to live in a cycle of striving, defending, and fearing. Fragility is the constant risk, and exhaustion is the constant result. Day after day, we pour energy into sustaining a version of ourselves that the ego demands, yet that version is never enough to satisfy it. The cost is high, and the reward is fleeting. And so, as long as the ego rules our lives, fragility, and exhaustion remain our companions, quietly shaping every choice we make, every thought we carry, and every burden we bear. The ego is not our full identity. It is only a mask we show to the world. It is a carefully constructed image, shaped by our experiences, our culture, and our desire to be accepted. This mask is built from the roles we play, the titles we carry, the successes we display, and even the defenses we hide behind. It is what we want others to see, what we want them to believe about us, and sometimes even what we try to convince ourselves is true. But deep within, beyond the surface, lies a self that is far larger, far richer, and far more complex than the mask the ego presents. The mask serves a purpose. It allows us to interact with society, to function in groups, to find a place within the world. We all wear it to some degree. In one setting, the mask might be confident and authoritative. In another, it might be gentle and agreeable. The ego adjusts the mask according to what it believes will earn recognition or protection. In this way, the mask becomes a survival tool, helping us navigate the expectations of others. But problems arise when we begin to confuse the mask with who we really are. When the mask becomes our identity, we begin to live for appearances rather than authenticity. We measure our value through how convincing the mask appears, how polished it seems, and how well it hides the doubts underneath. This creates a gap between the self we show and the self we feel. That gap grows heavy over time because maintaining the mask requires constant effort. Smiles must be managed, strengths must be exaggerated, weaknesses must be concealed. The energy spent in sustaining the mask drains us, yet the ego insists it is necessary because it fears what might happen if the mask ever slips. The fragility of the mask is its greatest weakness. It can be shattered by criticism, weakened by failure, or threatened by rejection. Since the ego clings to the mask as if it were the whole self, any crack in it feels like a wound to our very being. A careless remark, a lost opportunity, or a moment of embarrassment can leave us feeling exposed and unworthy. Yet these wounds are not strikes against the true self. They are strikes against the mask. The true self remains deeper, untouched, waiting for recognition. The mask also limits us. Because it is designed for approval, it resists risks that might expose imperfection. It makes us hesitant to admit mistakes, to show vulnerability, or to reveal uncertainty. It convinces us to act stronger than we feel, happier than we are, or more certain than we know. Over time, we begin to live not as ourselves, but as the mask believes we should be. This creates a kind of distance between our inner world and our outer life, and that distance often becomes a source of restlessness, confusion, and dissatisfaction. Despite this, the mask is not inherently false. It is simply incomplete. It contains parts of us, our abilities, our choices, our expressions, but it does not contain the whole of who we are. Beneath the mask are thoughts we never speak, feelings we never reveal, and potential we have not yet expressed. The self is vast, while the mask is narrow. The self is fluid, while the mask is rigid. To believe the mask is the whole self is to reduce the richness of who we are to a single role, a single image, a single performance. There are moments when the mask slips, when life strips away the image we have built. In those moments, we may feel naked, exposed, or lost, but we may also glimpse the deeper self that has always been there. That self is not defined by roles or appearances. It does not depend on recognition or approval. It is not shaken by failure or rejection. It is steady, silent, and waiting to be acknowledged. The ego, however, resists this deeper truth because it cannot control it. The ego fears that without the mask, we will not be accepted, respected, or valued, and so it clings tightly to appearances, urging us to polish and protect them. But the irony is that in trying to preserve the mask, we often neglect the self. We lose touch with the authenticity that would allow us to live more freely and more fully. The ego is not our full identity. It is only a mask we show to the world. And though the mask may serve us in many ways, it can never replace the depth of the self that lies beneath it. The self is larger, stronger, and more enduring than any image the ego can create. Yet as long as we live through the mask alone, we remain trapped in the narrow space between appearance and truth, always performing, never resting, always seeking approval, never truly being. Mistaking the mask for the real self leads to illusion and dissatisfaction. The mask, shaped by the ego, is built to please, to impress, to shield us from judgment. It is a projection carefully crafted from what we think others want to see, what society rewards, and what we hope will earn us approval. At first glance, it feels like protection. It allows us to navigate the expectations of the world. But when we begin to confuse this mask with our true identity, we enter a realm of illusion. The image becomes more important than the substance, and in striving to keep the mask intact, we slowly lose touch with who we really are. The dissatisfaction emerges when the mask fails to deliver the fulfillment it promises. We may gain recognition, applause, or approval through our performance, but the satisfaction is fleeting. The world applauds the mask, not the self, and deep down, we feel the emptiness of that difference. Praise feels hollow because it is directed at the image, not at the person beneath it. Success feels unstable because it is tied to appearances, not to inner truth. The more we rely on the mask, the more we sense the disconnection and the more restless we become. Living through illusion also isolates us. When we mistake the mask for the self, we present a version of ourselves that others can never fully connect with. Relationships become fragile because they are built on appearances rather than authenticity. People may admire us, but they cannot truly know us, and this leaves us feeling unseen even when surrounded by attention. The illusion of the mask keeps us in constant performance, but the deeper self remains hidden, longing to be acknowledged. The dissatisfaction grows as we realize that even in our most celebrated moments, we still feel alone. The illusion is further strengthened by fear. The ego convinces us that without the mask, we would be rejected or dismissed. It whispers that the authentic self is not enough, that it must be polished, filtered, or disguised to be acceptable. And so, we hold on to the mask tightly, terrified of what might happen if it slips. But this fear itself reveals the fragility of the illusion. If the mask were truly the self, it would not need constant protection. The fact that it must be guarded at all costs shows that it is only a construct, a fragile layer that cannot withstand full scrutiny. The dissatisfaction often appears in quiet moments when the performance pauses. Alone with ourselves, we feel the gap between who we are and who we pretend to be. Achievements that once seemed meaningful lose their glow. Praise that once lifted us feels shallow. The restless thought appears, is this really me? Is this all there is? These questions mark the beginning of awareness, but until they are faced, the dissatisfaction lingers, growing stronger with each attempt to silence it. The illusion of the mask also limits growth. Because the mask must always appear strong, we hesitate to admit weakness. Because it must appear successful, we resist failure. Because it must appear certain, we avoid vulnerability. In this way, the mask traps us in a narrow version of ourselves, blocking the depth and richness of what we could become. The ego convinces us that the mask is safety, but in truth, it is a cage. The dissatisfaction grows from this restriction, because deep within, the self longs to expand, to express, to evolve, while the mask insists on staying fixed. To mistake the mask for the real self is to live in a constant state of tension. We chase recognition but remain unfulfilled. We perform strength but feel fragile. We create illusions of happiness while carrying quiet dissatisfaction inside. The mask may convince the world for a time, but it can never convince the self. And as long as the mask is mistaken for identity, the cycle of illusion and dissatisfaction continues, pulling us further from the deeper wholeness we silently seek. Mastering the ego begins with observing it honestly. The ego thrives in the shadows of our awareness, operating silently, disguising its motives as necessity, ambition, or strength. It whispers in our decisions, colors our relationships, and fuels our insecurities, yet it rarely introduces itself directly. To begin mastering it, we must first see it, not with judgment, but with clarity. Observation is the first step, because without awareness, the ego remains the invisible puppeteer, pulling strings we do not realize exist. Honest observation means turning inward with the courage to witness the small ways the ego shows itself. It is in the sting we feel when someone else receives praise. It is in the defensiveness that rises when our ideas are questioned. It is in the urge to interrupt, to correct, to dominate a conversation, not because truth is at stake, but because we want to be seen as right. The ego appears in subtle gestures. A hesitation to admit fault, a silent craving for approval, a hidden satisfaction in another's failure. These are not flaws to condemn, but signals to recognize. By noticing them, we bring the ego into the light. The honesty required is not always comfortable. The ego resists exposure because its power lies in disguise. It prefers us to believe that our anger is always justified, our ambition always noble, our pride always earned. To observe honestly is to pierce these illusions and ask, is this truly strength, or is it my ego seeking control? Is this confidence, or is it a mask to hide my doubt? These questions strip away the excuses the ego builds, revealing its true nature beneath the surface. Observation must be consistent. The ego is not an occasional visitor. It is ever present, shifting forms depending on the situation. In moments of success, it whispers, "Look how great you are." In moments of failure, it sneers, "You are nothing without recognition." In relationships, it demands to be admired. In solitude, it insists on being restless. To master it, we cannot observe only once and believe the work is done. We must develop the habit of awareness, catching the ego in its many disguises, patiently watching without becoming entangled in its games. This practice of observation is not about silencing or destroying the ego. It is about creating space between ourselves and its voice. When we see it clearly, we no longer confuse it with the whole of who we are. The anger becomes not "I am angry," but "this is my ego resisting vulnerability." The jealousy becomes not "I am unworthy," but "this is my ego comparing itself." In that shift, we gain freedom. By observing honestly, we transform reactions into choices. Honesty also means acknowledging how deeply the ego shapes our lives. It is tempting to believe that others are ruled by ego while we are free of it. But the very thought, "I am beyond ego," is itself the ego speaking. To observe honestly is to accept that no one escapes its influence completely. It is part of the human mind, and to deny it only strengthens its hold. Mastery begins not with denial, but with humility, the willingness to see how often we are moved by forces we would rather ignore. The process of observation requires patience. The ego will resist, adapt, and disguise itself again and again. It will try to convince us that it is gone, only to reappear in another form. But with steady attention, patterns emerge. We notice the triggers that awaken it, the insecurities that feed it, the illusions it clings to. Each recognition weakens its grip because awareness interrupts its automatic power. There is strength in simply watching, to sit with jealousy without acting on it, to feel pride without being consumed by it, to notice defensiveness without letting it control our words. These are acts of quiet mastery. They do not eliminate the ego, but they place it back in proportion. The ego becomes one voice among many within us, not the ruler of our identity. Mastering the ego begins with observing it honestly, because honesty is the doorway to freedom. When we see clearly, we are no longer bound by illusions. When we name the ego's presence, we step outside of its control. The work is ongoing, the practice lifelong, but with each moment of awareness, the ego's power lessens and the deeper self begins to emerge. Self-reflection helps us ask, am I acting from fear or from true strength? This question lies at the heart of understanding our own motives. Every action we take, every word we speak, and every choice we make carries an origin. It is either rooted in the restless grip of fear or the steady foundation of strength. Yet most of us rarely pause long enough to uncover which one is driving us. We often assume our actions are logical, necessary, or noble, without realizing how deeply fear can disguise itself as wisdom, caution, or ambition. Self-reflection shines a light into these hidden places, forcing us to look at the truth with honesty. Fear is subtle. It does not always appear as trembling or hesitation. Sometimes fear speaks with urgency, insisting we must prove ourselves, outdo others, or defend our worth at any cost. It appears when we avoid risks because we fear failure, or when we cling to relationships because we fear loneliness. It even hides in perfectionism, the relentless demand to appear flawless, because beneath it lies the fear of being judged or rejected. Fear narrows our vision, keeping us trapped in cycles of comparison and self-doubt, convincing us that survival means constant control. Strength, on the other hand, operates with quiet confidence. It does not need to shout, nor does it seek endless validation. Strength allows us to step forward even when outcomes are uncertain. It speaks in the willingness to be authentic, even if others disapprove. It shows itself in the patience to wait when rushing would only serve the ego. True strength is not the absence of vulnerability. Rather, it is the courage to move forward despite vulnerability. When our actions are rooted in strength, they carry a sense of alignment, of integrity, of peace that fear can never provide. The challenge is that fear often imitates strength. We tell ourselves we are being careful, when in truth, we are avoiding growth. We say we are ambitious, when in reality, we are chasing approval to quiet inner doubts. We pretend we are standing firm, but beneath the surface, we are terrified of losing control. Self-reflection exposes these disguises. It asks us to pause before action and inquire. Is this choice expanding me or shrinking me? Am I protecting myself from imaginary pain, or am I moving forward with trust in my deeper self? The honesty of these questions creates clarity. Self-reflection is not about shaming ourselves for acting out of fear. It is about recognizing it. Everyone acts from fear at times. It is part of the human experience. The difference lies in whether we remain blind to it or whether we bring it into awareness. By acknowledging when fear is driving us, we reclaim the power to choose differently. We can decide to step into strength, not because fear disappears, but because we refuse to let it dictate our path. The practice of asking this question, fear or strength, builds inner resilience. At first, the answer may be clouded. We may not always know, but with time, patterns reveal themselves. We notice that certain environments awaken fear, while others invite strength. We see that certain people trigger our insecurities, while others encourage our growth. The more we observe, the clearer the distinction becomes. When we act from fear, the results often leave us drained, anxious, or regretful. There is a hollowness to victories achieved through fear because they are never enough. The ego, fed by fear, always demands more validation, more control, more recognition. But when we act from strength, even the smallest actions feel fulfilling. There is a sense of wholeness, a quiet satisfaction that does not depend on applause. Facing the ego is a practice, not a single act. Each time we catch it in action, in jealousy, in pride, in defensiveness, we weaken its chains. Each time we admit its presence without judgment, we reclaim a piece of our freedom. With patience, these small victories accumulate, and the path ahead grows clearer. The ego no longer dictates every step. Instead, it becomes a teacher, showing us where we are still bound. By facing it again and again, we unlock the possibility of living from a deeper, freer self. When ego is mastered, validation is replaced by meaning. The search for validation is one of the ego's strongest cravings. It is that restless desire to be noticed, to be admired, to be approved of, to be told that we matter in the eyes of others. Validation, in itself, is not wrong. It is a natural human need to connect and to be recognized. But when validation becomes the primary source of our worth, it transforms into a chain. We become prisoners to the opinions of others, constantly adjusting our behavior, appearance, and choices to win approval. This endless cycle may bring moments of satisfaction, but it never lasts. The ego demands more with every success, and what was enough yesterday feels empty today. Mastering the ego breaks this cycle, not by rejecting validation completely, but by no longer depending on it as the foundation of identity. When the ego loosens its grip, the need for constant approval fades, and in its place rises something deeper: meaning. Meaning does not depend on applause or recognition. It is found in alignment with our values, in the pursuit of growth, in creating something that reflects truth rather than performance. Meaning does not shout as loudly as validation, but it sustains us in ways validation never can. To understand the difference, imagine creating something purely for recognition. A project, an achievement, an act of kindness, all driven by the hope that others will notice. The moment praise comes, the ego swells, but soon after it demands more. The joy is shallow, fading as quickly as it arrived. Now imagine creating something because it expresses who you are, because it resonates with your deepest values, because it feels authentic regardless of how others respond. Even if no one applauds, the act itself holds weight, because it carries meaning. One path leaves you enslaved to the shifting winds of opinion, the other roots you in lasting fulfillment. Meaning arises when we act from authenticity rather than performance. It is the difference between helping someone because it looks good and helping because compassion moved us. It is the difference between pursuing a career to impress others and pursuing it because it reflects our passion and purpose. The ego cares about appearances. Meaning cares about truth. When the ego is mastered, the applause of the world matters less than the quiet alignment within ourselves. Replacing validation with meaning changes the way we experience success. Success driven by validation is fragile. It collapses the moment recognition fades. Success driven by meaning endures because it is not tied to external approval. It is measured by inner growth, by the lives touched, by the authenticity expressed. Even failure looks different in this light. When our worth is tied to validation, failure feels devastating, a personal collapse. But when we are guided by meaning, failure becomes part of the journey, a teacher rather than a threat. This shift also transforms relationships. The ego seeks validation through others, treating them as mirrors to reflect its worth. It manipulates, competes, or clings, all in search of affirmation. But when meaning takes the place of validation, relationships deepen. We no longer ask others to constantly prove our value. Instead, we meet them with authenticity. We give without the hidden expectation of praise. We listen without the need to dominate. We love without making possession the goal. In this space, connections become more genuine because they are rooted in meaning rather than ego-driven performance. The transition from validation to meaning requires practice. The ego will resist, urging us to check for approval, to seek recognition, to measure our worth in comparisons. But each time we notice this pull and choose meaning instead, we strengthen our freedom. We remind ourselves that applause fades, but authenticity endures. We remind ourselves that external approval is fleeting, but inner alignment is unshakable. Mastering the ego does not mean we stop enjoying validation. It means we stop depending on it. A compliment can still feel good, applause can still be encouraging, but they no longer define us. Our identity is not at the mercy of shifting opinions. We become anchored in meaning, and that anchor holds firm in both praise and silence, in success and in failure. When validation is replaced by meaning, life itself changes texture. Instead of chasing every fleeting sign of approval, we move with purpose. Instead of fearing judgment, we embrace authenticity. Instead of being drained by the endless hunger of the ego, we are nourished by the quiet strength of alignment. This is the freedom of mastering the ego. To live not for recognition, but for meaning. a meaning that outlasts applause, a meaning that cannot be taken away. Competition with others gives way to inner growth and wholeness. Much of life is presented to us as a race to succeed, to accumulate, to be admired, to prove that we are more accomplished, more talented, or more deserving than those around us. From an early age, we are conditioned to compare ourselves, to measure our worth against the achievements of others, as though life were a contest with limited rewards. The ego thrives in this environment. It feeds on comparison, convincing us that our value depends not on who we are, but on how we stand relative to those around us. As long as we remain trapped in this game, our sense of identity remains fragile, always dependent on the shifting performance of others. Competition can inspire growth at times, but when ruled by ego, it blinds us. It makes us believe that for us to win, someone else must lose. It pushes us to chase recognition, even at the cost of peace, authenticity, or balance. It whispers that our progress is meaningless unless it exceeds another's. This constant measuring creates a restless hunger that never ends. Even when we achieve victories, the ego quickly looks to the next person ahead of us, pointing out how much further we must go. No matter what we gain, it never feels like enough. But when we begin to master the ego, something profound shifts. The need to outshine others loses its grip, and we begin to turn inward. We realize that the real contest was never with others, but with our own fears, doubts, and limitations. The energy once wasted on constant comparison is redirected toward growth, healing, and self-discovery. The question changes from, am I better than them, to am I becoming more aligned with myself? This shift is not about abandoning ambition, but about grounding ambition in authenticity rather than competition. Inner growth is not measured by trophies or applause. It is measured by the ability to recognize our patterns, to heal from old wounds, to cultivate resilience, and to step into authenticity without fear. It is about learning to listen to ourselves deeply, about making choices that reflect who we truly are rather than what others expect of us. Growth is found in the courage to admit our flaws, the humility to learn from mistakes, and the patience to continue evolving. When we stop competing with others, we finally have the space to compete with who we were yesterday. And that is the only competition that truly matters. As competition dissolves, wholeness begins to emerge. Wholeness is the sense that we do not need to constantly prove ourselves to be valuable. It is the recognition that we are already enough, even as we continue to grow. It does not mean perfection, it means integration. Wholeness comes when we embrace both our strengths and our weaknesses, our successes and our failures, seeing them as parts of the same unfolding journey. Instead of being divided by the pressure to appear superior, we become unified within ourselves. Wholeness also changes how we see others. Without the lens of competition, we no longer view them as threats to our worth, but as companions on their own journeys. Their successes no longer diminish us. Instead, they can inspire us. Their struggles no longer elevate us. Instead, they awaken empathy. Relationships deepen when competition fades, because we stop trying to win and start trying to connect. We recognize that each person has their own path, and our fulfillment does not depend on surpassing them, but on honoring our own. The ego resists this shift, clinging to the belief that life is a ladder and we must climb higher than the rest. But once we begin to taste the peace of inner growth and wholeness, the appeal of competition weakens. Hence the endless race feels shallow compared to the richness of authenticity. We discover that life is not about being ahead of others, but about being aligned within ourselves. In this alignment, growth becomes natural, and wholeness becomes the ground on which we stand. When competition with others gives way to inner growth, life slows down. We are no longer driven by restless comparison, but guided by deeper purpose. We become free to grow at our own pace, free to celebrate others without fear, free to create meaning without the need for applause. In this freedom, we step into wholeness, a state where we no longer chase superiority, but embrace authenticity, balance, and peace. Relationships deepen when we release the need to dominate or defend. Much of the tension in human connection comes not from love itself, but from the ego's interference. The ego views relationships as arenas where one must maintain control, prove superiority, or protect pride at all costs. It whispers that being wrong is weakness, that yielding is defeat, and that vulnerability is dangerous. As long as we listen to these whispers, our relationships remain shallow, tangled in the constant push and pull of domination and defense. But when we let go of these impulses, when we choose presence over power and openness over armor, our connections gain a depth that cannot be reached through ego. The need to dominate often shows up subtly. It may surface in the urge to always have the last word, to correct another person's perspective, or to control the direction of a conversation. Domination is not always loud. It can be quiet and strategic, hidden in manipulation, or disguised as care. At its core, it comes from the ego's hunger to feel superior, to establish its position as stronger, wiser, or more important. But domination erodes trust. The moment one person feels overshadowed or silenced, the space for authenticity shrinks. True connection cannot thrive where one voice is constantly elevated above another. On the other side is the need to defend, which often arises from fear of being exposed. The ego resists criticism because it feels like a direct threat to its image. It rushes to explain, to justify, to argue, to protect the mask we present to the world. We defend even when no attack is intended, interpreting questions as accusations and suggestions as judgments. While defense feels like protection in the moment, it builds invisible walls. Over time, these walls separate us from those we love, leaving us isolated even in close proximity. When we release the need to dominate or defend, something shifts. We begin to listen, not to prepare our response, but to truly hear. We stop trying to win conversations and instead aim to understand. We allow space for another person's truth, even if it challenges ours, even if it makes us uncomfortable. This kind of listening is not passive. It is active presence, an act of respect that builds trust. In that trust, relationships deepen because both people feel safe enough to be authentic. Releasing the ego's grip also means embracing vulnerability. Without the shield of defense, we can admit mistakes without feeling diminished. Without the drive to dominate, we can express love without fearing that openness makes us weak. Vulnerability is the soil where intimacy grows. It invites others to put down their defenses too, creating a space where honesty and compassion replace competition and pride. This shift does not mean we suppress our boundaries or silence our voices. It means we express ourselves without needing to overpower or protect an image. We can say no without hostility, disagree without hostility, and admit pain without shame. The absence of domination and defense does not make us powerless. It makes us stronger, because our strength comes from authenticity rather than ego. The depth that emerges in relationships built on this foundation is profound. Conflicts no longer spiral into battles of ego. They become opportunities for understanding and growth. Joy is shared more freely, because it is not clouded by the hidden competition of who is more successful or admired. Silence between two people becomes comfortable rather than threatening, because there is no longer a need to fill every space with performance. Releasing the need to dominate or defend also transforms the way we see others. Instead of opponents or mirrors of our worth, we see them as fellow travelers on their own journeys. We allow them to be imperfect without judgment, to succeed without jealousy, to struggle without condescension. We give them the freedom to be themselves because we no longer need them to validate us. In that freedom, love expands. Letting go of domination and defense is not a one-time choice, but a continuous practice. The ego will continue to tempt us, urging us to protect pride or assert superiority. But each time we resist the pull and choose openness instead, our relationships grow deeper roots. Over time, this practice builds bonds that are resilient, not because they are free of conflict, but because they are free of the ego's insistence on winning. When domination and defense fall away, what remains is connection, raw, honest, and unguarded. This is the soil where love grows deeper, where friendship becomes more genuine, and where trust becomes unshakable. It is here, beyond the ego's need to control or protect, that relationships reveal their true depth and power. Creativity flourishes when we are no longer paralyzed by fear of failure. Every human being carries within them a spark of imagination, a natural capacity to create, to explore, to give form to ideas that have never existed before. Yet for many, that spark lies buried beneath the weight of fear. The fear of not being good enough, the fear of being judged, the fear of trying and falling short. This fear does not merely whisper, it suffocates. It tells us not to start, not to risk, not to expose ourselves to the possibility of failure. And in listening to it, we silence our own creativity. Fear of failure disguises itself as caution, as practicality, even as wisdom. It tells us, wait until you're ready. Don't attempt it until you are certain it will succeed. Do what is safe, what is proven, what will be accepted. On the surface, these warnings sound protective, but in reality, they are chains. They keep us locked in cycles of hesitation, watching opportunities pass, while our creative energy turns inward and becomes frustration. The tragedy is not in failing, but in never allowing ourselves the chance to create at all. When fear holds us, creativity becomes a prisoner. The blank page remains empty because we fear it will not be perfect. The canvas stays untouched because we imagine others will laugh at our attempt. Ideas stay trapped in our minds, unspoken, because we believe they will not measure up. Fear demands certainty where creativity thrives on exploration. Fear wants guarantees, but creativity lives in the unknown. As long as fear dominates, creativity cannot breathe. But the moment we begin to loosen fear's grip, something remarkable happens. When we give ourselves permission to try without the guarantee of success, creativity awakens. It does not demand perfection, it asks only for expression. It grows in the act of doing, not in the outcome. When we stop measuring every idea against imagined criticism, we allow our thoughts to flow more freely. We discover that failure is not an end, but a teacher, guiding us toward refinement, depth, and authenticity. Creativity flourishes in freedom. The freedom to take risks, to experiment, to stumble and rise again. Every great creation in history was born not from certainty, but from willingness. Willingness to explore uncharted territory, willingness to embrace mistakes, willingness to persist when others doubted. Those who create boldly are not free from fear. They simply refuse to let fear silence them. They understand that failure is not a verdict on their worth, but a stepping stone toward growth. When fear of failure dissolves, even small acts of creativity feel expansive. Writing a few lines becomes liberating, painting a single stroke becomes joyful, sharing an idea becomes empowering. The focus shifts from outcome to process. Instead of asking, "Will this be good enough?" we ask, "What can I discover in the act of creating?" This shift transforms creativity from a performance for approval into a journey of exploration. And in exploration, the soul feels alive. The flourishing of creativity also enriches every aspect of life. It is not limited to art or music or writing. It seeps into problem solving, into relationships, into the way we approach challenges. A mind unafraid of failure becomes a mind willing to innovate. A heart unafraid of rejection becomes a heart willing to express itself fully. When creativity flows, it brings freshness, energy, and possibilities into all we do. Releasing the fear of failure does not mean failure disappears. We will still make mistakes, encounter obstacles, and face rejection. But the difference is in how we meet them. Instead of shrinking back, we continue forward. Instead of interpreting failure as proof of inadequacy, we see it as proof of courage, evidence that we dared to create. Over time, each so-called failure adds to our depth, our resilience, and our mastery. Creativity cannot be measured by success alone. Its true measure is the freedom it brings, the joy of expression, the discovery of new possibilities. When fear of failure no longer paralyzes us, we tap into an endless well of imagination, a resource that grows the more we use it. We begin to live more boldly, not only in art, but in life itself. For in every act of fearless creativity, we reclaim a piece of our freedom, and in that freedom, creativity blooms. Mastery is not destroying the ego, but integrating it into balance. The ego, often misunderstood, is not a villain that must be banished from our lives. It is a part of us, a necessary structure that gives us individuality, identity, and the ability to function in the world. Without it, we would have no sense of I, no boundary between ourselves and others, no anchor in reality. To try to destroy the ego completely would be to erase an essential part of human existence. True mastery comes not from eradicating the ego, but from placing it in harmony with the deeper aspects of who we are. The ego thrives on recognition, achievement, and control. It wants to define us through roles, titles, possessions, and accomplishments. When left unchecked, it takes over, convincing us that we are only as valuable as our success, our appearance, or the approval we receive. This creates imbalance, for the ego begins to dominate the stage of our life, drowning out the quieter, more authentic parts of ourselves. Yet the solution is not to destroy the ego, but to gently guide it back into its rightful place as one voice among many within us, not the only voice, not the loudest, but a necessary part of the chorus. Integration requires honesty. We must see the ego clearly, its need for validation, its insecurities, its desire to prove itself. Instead of condemning these traits, we can learn to observe them with understanding. The ego, after all, developed to protect us. It built defenses to shield us from rejection, failure, and pain. In its own way, it believed it was serving us. By recognizing this, we can approach the ego with compassion rather than hostility. Mastery is not a war within, but a reconciliation, an acknowledgement of each part of ourselves and its role in our growth. When the ego is balanced, it serves rather than controls. It becomes the part of us that helps us navigate society, communicate, and set boundaries. It allows us to take pride in our work without being enslaved by it. It gives us confidence to express ourselves while not mistaking expression for the whole of who we are. Balanced, the ego becomes a tool, sharp, useful, effective, but no longer the master of our identity. The danger of trying to destroy the ego is that it creates a new form of imbalance. In rejecting the ego, we may deny our individuality, our ambitions, or our natural human needs. We may fall into passivity, believing we must detach completely from the self to be free. Yet freedom does not lie in erasure, it lies in integration. To live fully is to embrace both our individuality and our deeper self, to honor the practical needs of the ego while grounding them in authenticity and meaning. Think of the ego as a mask we wear in the world. The mask is not false. It is part of us, a way we interact with others, a role we play in society. The problem comes when we mistake the mask for our entire being. Mastery is the awareness that the mask is useful, but it is not the whole. We can put it on and take it off. We can wear it when necessary and set it aside when it no longer serves. Integration is knowing when to listen to the ego and when to look beyond it. As we integrate the ego, balance begins to shape our lives. We no longer chase recognition desperately, nor do we reject ambition completely. We learn to act not from insecurity, but from purpose. We set goals, but they no longer define our worth. We express confidence, but it does not harden into arrogance. We care about others' opinions, but they no longer control us. The ego is present, but it is tempered by awareness, humility, and connection to something deeper than itself. This integration leads to a quieter strength, a strength not built on proving superiority, but on inner stability, a strength that allows us to stand firm without aggression, to succeed without losing ourselves, to fail without collapsing. The ego, once restless and demanding, becomes a steady ally, guiding us in the world while leaving space for our authentic self to shine. Mastery is not about conquering ourselves, but about creating inner harmony. The ego does not need to be silenced or destroyed. It needs to be placed in its proper role. When we achieve this balance, we move through life with clarity, with freedom, and with a deeper connection to who we truly are. In integration, we find wholeness, not as fragmented parts at war, but as a unified self, where the ego no longer rules, but serves. True freedom comes from overcoming pride, envy, and insecurity. These forces, though often invisible in daily life, quietly dictate, your choices, shape our relationships, and confine the way we see ourselves. They live beneath the surface of our actions, whispering into our thoughts, pushing us toward comparison, competition, and self-doubt. To overcome them is not simply to act differently on the outside, but to undergo a profound shift on the inside, a shift that frees us from being ruled by fragile illusions of worth. Pride, at first glance, does not always appear harmful. It can feel like strength, confidence, or dignity. Yet when pride becomes inflated, it blinds us. It convinces us that we must always appear superior, that admitting mistakes is weakness, that vulnerability will make us small. In this state, pride becomes a prison. It locks us into rigid patterns where we cannot grow because growth would mean acknowledging imperfection. Freedom begins when we release the need to stand above others and allow ourselves to be human, capable of failure, capable of learning, capable of connection without superiority. True confidence does not come from pride, but from humility, from knowing we have value without needing to inflate it. Envy, too, is a quiet thief of freedom. It convinces us that what others have determines our worth. We look at someone's success and feel diminished. We see another's beauty, talent, or recognition and believe it takes something away from us. Envy narrows our vision until we cannot see our own potential, only the shadow cast by others. This constant comparison keeps us restless, always chasing what lies outside ourselves, never satisfied with what we already hold. Freedom comes when we break envy's grip and learn to celebrate others without losing sight of our own journey. It is the moment we realize that someone else's light does not dim our own, that life is not a competition but a canvas where each of us paints differently. Insecurity may be the deepest chain of all. It feeds both pride and envy, driving us to mask our true selves or constantly measure our worth against others. Insecurity tells us that we are not enough, not successful enough, not attractive enough, not intelligent enough. It creates a restless hunger for validation, pushing us to seek approval in every corner of life. But no matter how much we gain, insecurity whispers that it is not enough. This endless cycle robs us of peace. True freedom is born when we face insecurity directly, when we stop running from it and begin to see it as an illusion. For our worth does not come from external measures. It exists inherently in simply being alive, in being whole as we are. Overcoming these forces is not a one-time act, but a lifelong practice. Pride will rise again, envy will creep in, insecurity will whisper. But with awareness, we begin to recognize them for what they are, distortions of truth. Instead of reacting blindly, we pause. We ask ourselves, is this pride defending my growth or hiding my fear? Is this envy distracting me from my own path? Is this insecurity a reflection of reality or just a voice from the past? Each time we confront these questions honestly, we loosen their grip. When pride softens into humility, we open ourselves to learning and to genuine connection with others. When envy transforms into inspiration, we shift from competition to growth, using the success of others as fuel rather than poison. When insecurity is replaced with self-acceptance, we no longer need constant validation. We stand steady in our own worth, and in that steadiness, freedom blossoms. Freedom here is not simply the absence of restrictions, it is the presence of inner peace. It is the ability to move through life without being driven by comparison, without being trapped by the need to prove ourselves, without shrinking from fear of inadequacy. It is the spaciousness that comes when our actions are guided not by pride, envy, or insecurity, but by authenticity, curiosity, and love. This freedom changes the quality of our lives. It changes the way we work, because our efforts are no longer fueled by proving ourselves, but by expressing ourselves. It changes the way we relate, because we no longer need to dominate or compete, but can connect openly and honestly. It changes the way we see ourselves, because worth is no longer conditional. It is constant, unshaken by external outcomes. True freedom is not about controlling the world around us. It is about liberating the world within us. Pride, envy, and insecurity are chains we forge ourselves, but they are chains we can break. And once they are broken, we discover that freedom was never about what we gain from outside. It was always about releasing what held us captive inside. The greatest liberation is not conquering the world, but conquering illusions within. So much of life is spent striving outward, chasing achievements, possessions, and recognition. We are taught to believe that success is measured by what we acquire, by the status we hold, by the influence we exert over others. We admire those who seem to have conquered the world, who stand on the peaks of wealth, power, or fame. Yet beneath these victories often lies the same unrest, the same longing, the same emptiness. For conquering the world brings no peace if the illusions within remain unchallenged. Illusions are the hidden chains of the mind. They are not obvious, yet they direct so much of our lives. The illusion that we must always be more than we are. The illusion that happiness lies outside of us, waiting to be captured. The illusion that our worth is dependent on comparison, approval, or possessions. These illusions blur our vision, making us mistake shadows for substance. We chase endlessly, yet the satisfaction fades as quickly as it arrives, because the root problem was never external. It was the illusions we carried inside. Conquering these illusions requires courage, for they are deeply woven into the way we see ourselves and the world. They whisper constantly, if only you had this, you would be fulfilled. If only you were admired, you would be secure. If only you reached this level, you would finally rest. And so we chase. We conquer one goal, then another, and another, but peace never arrives. The illusion shifts the target, always moving it just beyond our reach. Real liberation begins when we recognize this cycle for what it is, a trap of the mind, not a law of reality. The conquest of the world is limited. No matter how much we gain, we are bound by time, by circumstance, by the impermanence of all things. But the conquest of illusion is limitless. It frees us in ways no external victory ever can. When we pierce the illusion that our value is tied to status, we stop living in constant fear of losing it. When we dissolve the illusion that happiness comes from comparison, we stop measuring ourselves against others and begin to live our own lives fully. When we shatter the illusion that we must be perfect to be worthy, we embrace our humanity and find peace in simply being. This inner conquest does not mean abandoning ambition or denying the outer world. It means moving through the world with clarity rather than blindness. We can still pursue goals, build, create, and achieve, but we do so without being enslaved by illusions. Success is no longer a desperate attempt to prove ourselves, but an authentic expression of who we are. Failure is no longer unbearable because it does not define our worth. With illusions conquered, the external world loses its power to control our inner state. The greatest liberation is subtle but profound. It is waking up each day no longer burdened by the weight of appearances. It is moving through challenges without being consumed by the fear of inadequacy. It is enjoying success without clinging to it and facing failure without collapsing. This liberation gives us space to breathe, space to create, space to live honestly. It allows us to engage fully with the world while remaining free within ourselves. History shows countless examples of individuals who conquered nations, built empires, or amassed fortunes, only to be left restless and unfulfilled. Their external triumphs could not free them from the illusions within. At the same time, there are those who, with little in the way of possessions or worldly power, found a freedom that radiated peace, wisdom, and strength. Their liberation did not come from outward conquest, but from seeing through the illusions that bind most of humanity. To conquer illusions is to see reality more clearly. It is to realize that happiness is not something to be earned, but something to be uncovered within. It is to recognize that our worth is not conditional, but inherent. It is to understand that the endless comparisons, competitions, and masks we wear are shadows, and that behind them, we are already whole. The world outside can be chaotic, unpredictable, and uncontrollable. But the illusions within, those we can face, those we can conquer. And when we do, the world outside loses its power to enslave us. The greatest liberation is not in bending the world to our will, but in freeing ourselves from the illusions that distort our vision of it. Once those illusions fall, life itself feels lighter, clearer, and more real. That is a conquest greater than any empire, for it is the conquest of the self. True liberation is not about conquering the world outside, but about conquering the illusions inside. When we see clearly, when we release the chains of pride, comparison, and false beliefs, we discover a freedom no circumstance can take away. This is the victory that endures, the victory that transforms the way we live, the way we love, and the way we see ourselves. Let us remember, the greatest conquest is not of the world, but of the illusions that keep us from truly living.